Welcome to Box Hill Baptist Church's series of webinars. We're starting a new process of delivering to you dialogues and webinars on matters of social importance, reflecting on them in social, historical and theological contexts. We're going to have speakers coming from within the Box Hill Baptist Church community and other invited guests. We will pre-record an address, and then at a later time we're going to have a Zoom webinar in which you can participate and be part of the dialogue. We invite you to look to our website for details or email the church office and you'll be sent an invitation for the webinar dialogue. Our first guest is Professor Emeritus Graeme Davison, the Emeritus Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor of History at Monash University. Graeme is a former President of the Australian Historical Association, a former Chairman of the Heritage Council of Victoria, and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and Humanities. He is an eminent historian and a prominent advisor and commentator on museums, heritage and urban policy. Graeme is going to be speaking to us and dialoguing with me about the current wave of defacing or deposing statues that has spread across various parts of the Western world, sparked originally in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I invite you to join with us as we reflect on toppling statues.
Well, what a year 2020 has been. When we look back, I suspect in future years, there'll be no doubt that what is foremost in our minds has been the coronavirus pandemic. But perhaps we'll also note that side by side with that, connecting with it in some ways, there's been another pandemic raging, a worldwide wave of attacks on public statues and monuments. Beginning in the United States after the killing of George Floyd, the cry Black Lives Matter has gone up and people have responded. All over the world, protesters have been toppling monuments and statues. Statue toppling is a form of protest that can stir strong reactions, and it can also stir deep reflections. People can get very upset about the damage to a bit of bronze or marble. And that suggests that statue toppling is not like damage to any other piece of public property. It makes us ask, is it a legitimate way of purging our history of things that we would rather not have in it? Or is it just an indiscriminate assault on cherished values and traditions? As a historian, I've been watching this movement with great interest. I'm a person who's been interested for a long while in the conservation of cultural heritage, and therefore I recoil when I see the destruction of public places. And yet I also remind myself that iconoclasm, the casting down and destruction of false gods and idols, has been a feature of reforming and revolutionary movements throughout the ages, in religion, of course, as well as in politics. As the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us, there can be a time to tear down as well as a time to build up. And so in conversation with Jim, I thought it would be interesting for us to discuss that from the different vantage points of a historian and a theologian. So I'm going to begin by offering some reflections on the contemporary scene, and then Jim will have some things to say, particularly about the biblical resonances of statue toppling. Just last month, supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement toppled a statue of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John Macdonald, in Montreal. Many of the demonstrators were Black Canadians, although the original victims of racist policies of that Macdonald government were mostly Native Canadians or Asians rather than African Americans. The Canadians were following the example of protesters just across the border in the United States, where in places like Virginia, protesters had aimed at the statues of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who'd been a hero of white segregationists. Statues of Christopher Columbus, long honoured as the discoverer of America, though he never actually landed on the continent, were later toppled or decapitated. In England, protesters called for the removal of the statue of an imperialist Cecil Rhodes from the facade of Oxford's Oriel College. In 2016, the college had resisted the movement, but eventually, in just this year, it capitulated. And now in Australia, the Black Lives Matter has also taken aim at Captain Cook, once regarded as the discoverer of white Australia. And as you can see here, his statue's been daubed with slogans that portray him as the author of a dispossession and genocide. As a tourist, I love the statues of national heroes, and I photograph them wherever I go. The people nations select as heroes tell us quite a bit about what they value, what they cherish. In Eastern and Northern Europe, I notice, it's often poets, like the Slovakian poet Jokai, or musicians, like the Estonian composer and conductor Gustav Emersaks, who are honoured as national heroes. Finns make statues of kings who championed their wars of independence against Russia. In general, I prefer peaceful, creative heroes to aristocratic or warlike ones, but even bad statues of bad people can teach us something about the past. What are statues for? When Europeans first came to Australia, they saw it as a new land. They were ignorant of the ancient culture of the Aboriginal people. Thinking that Australia was a new land and that their nation was young and free was inspiring, for it meant that their future was boundless. Yet they often yearned for a sense of tradition that came from the knowledge of having a deep past, and so they set out to create one. And erecting statues to the heroes of colonisation was one of the ways they did it. Monuments in durable materials like stone and bronze ensured that the knowledge of the colony's history would outlast their creators. Governor Richard Bourke, who brought responsible government to New South Wales, was one of the first colonial heroes to be immortalised in this way in 1842. Public statues also beautified the city. The statues clustered in Spring Street and the Domain enhanced these ceremonial parts of the city. Melbourne's most famous statue was a monument to heroic failure. The leaders of the Victorian exploring expedition, Bourke and Wills, who crossed the continent only to perish on the way back, spurning the help of the Aboriginal people who might have showed them how to survive. Statues were outdoor history lessons, erected to instil patriotism among the rising generation of young Australians. The huge crowds that attended the dedication ceremony of the statue of Captain Cook in 1879 included large numbers of school children, and the Premier, Sir Henry Parkes, reminded them how even children of humble birth like Cook, or indeed like himself, could achieve greatness. For 2 centuries, Cook remained an Australian hero. In 1970, the bicentennial of his expedition, Aboriginal children in Cooktown welcomed the British monarch waving Union Jacks. 2020 is also the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival, but the expected birthday celebrations, I think, have been conveniently and quietly shelved, perhaps wisely, in the midst of the corona crisis. The Victorian era was the great age of public monuments. After the mass slaughter of the Great War of 1914-18, many Australians began to question the glorification of military and imperial heroes. So rather than statues of dead heroes, they asked, wouldn't it be better to devote the money to building memorial hospitals or schools or libraries or swimming pools or recreation grounds? When monuments were erected, it was sometimes to honour people who'd been overlooked previously, like Victoria's pioneer women. While Melbourne got statues of Queen Victoria, King Edward VII and George V, George VI missed out, and maybe his daughter Queen Elizabeth will miss out too. Republican Ireland quietly removed the symbols of empire, like Queen Victoria. More recently, however, public statues have made a comeback, but in a more democratic style. In the Treasury Gardens, Henry Bolte and Albert Dunstan chat informally like old friends, while even war heroes like Weary Dunlop and Sir John Monash now appear in civvies rather than uniform and pose pensively, rather than proudly. The only heroes who are now high enough in public esteem to be raised on a pedestal are sporting heroes, like the legendary spin bowler Shane Warne and the Aboriginal footballer Nicky Winbar. For all that, I suspect statues are not quite as important as they used to be. After all, there are now more important and powerful ways of mass communication, like the cinema and the TV and the internet. Ask yourself how often you have stopped and looked at a public statue. For most of us, monuments are just part of the furniture of the city, rendered invisible by sheer familiarity. So one of the effects, I think, of the Black Lives Matter movement has been to make us look at them again, to raise these taken for granted features of our public landscape into public consciousness and ask, do we need them? When Jesus turned on the money changers and drove them out of the temple, wasn't he doing something just like that, forcing people to recognize the ugly reality behind a scene that for most temple goers was just business as usual? In fact, people have been toppling statues almost as long as they've been erecting them. Destroying a statue is a critical or sometimes prophetic attack on community values. Iconoclasm, the word we use for the breaking of images, derives originally from disputes within the Orthodox Church about the use and abuse of religious images in the 7th and 8th century. The Protestant Reformation unleashed another wave of iconoclasm, as the reformers sought to purge the church from pagan and popish superstition. Cathedrals and monasteries were stripped bare of holy pictures and effigies. King Henry VIII, who had dissolved the monasteries and laid them in ruins, handed them over to his even more staunchly Protestant son, Edward. In 1776, American colonists dramatised their reaction of British rule by tearing down a statue of the English King George III, while in 1789, the French revolutionaries did the same to Louis XVI. Hungarians seeking to overthrow Soviet rule tore down a statue of Stalin in 1956, while in 1991, Iraqis celebrated the overthrow of Saddam Hussein by felling his statue. Australia has been relatively immune from these waves of iconoclastic fervour, although in the 1980s, an attempt by local supporters of the IRA to blow up a statue of Queen Victoria, as you can see, inflicted minor injuries on the royal person. And at the height of the Vietnam War, protesters daubed anti-war slogans on what some would regard as the city's most sacred monument, the Shrine of Remembrance. In response to the Black Lives Matter movement, some Aboriginal activists now have sought and demanded the removal of the memorial cairns marking the route of the explorer and so-called pioneer of Gippsland, Angus MacMillan. MacMillan, as we now know, participated in several massacres of Aboriginal people. One of the descendants has even written a book acknowledging his crimes. Yet in Gippsland, the demand to abolish his memorials divided the local council almost evenly. As you can see from these slogans beside the memorial itself, there's quite contrasting reactions. So yes, some locals will say he did kill Aboriginal people, but that's just how it was then, and we shouldn't judge yesterday's people by today's standards. In fact, there were, of course, contemporaries who also condemned those killings. So it seems to me that in our public life, as in our religious life, we hold two impulses in tension. One, an impulse towards veneration or worship, and the other towards judgment and criticism. The philosopher Frederick Nietzsche distinguished between what he called monumental history, the history that builds up, and critical history, the history that judges and tears down. And both impulses are important in our religious and civic life. Too much veneration and we become complacent. Too much judgment, or judgmentalism particularly, and the links of the community begin to fray. Today it seems to be the disruptors who have the upper hand. Our world, they say, is so out of joint that it should be torn apart in the hope that something better will emerge from the wreckage. I don't altogether agree with them. Most of the great revolutions in religion and politics were inspired by positive ideals, even if they involved some demolition to realise them. Violence, even violence to images of stone and bronze, has a propensity to beget more violence. So no sooner had black protesters torn down that statue of Robert E. Lee than white supremacists tore down a statue of the black emancipist Frederick Douglass. And I'm a bit fearful that something of that same kind might be happening now in the United States. So it's important for us to ask, how should we respond to this pandemic of statue toppling? In 1990, one of the wisest of modern statesmen, Nelson Mandela, was invited to dedicate the reopened Settlers Monument in Grahamstown in South Africa. The monument was originally erected to commemorate the arrival in 1820 of the white, predominantly English settlers of Natal. But after the fall of apartheid, it was renovated to include all settlers, black, brown, white, of the new South Africa. And in his speech at the dedication, Mandela distinguished between two kinds of monument. Those which are dead or obsolete because they commemorate an outdated view of history, those which enshrine a living tradition, although they exclude some people who don't share that tradition. And finally, he thought there were monuments which recall aspects of the past and bring them to our mind for critical scrutiny. And the Settlers Monument, he thought, was such a monument. It reminded contemporaries of an aspect of national history in order to promote reform and reconciliation. I think Mandela's distinction between these kinds of monument is helpful. Despite the appeals of black nationalists, Mandela was generally reluctant to advocate the wholesale demolition of national monuments, even some monuments like the Voortrekker Monument in Transvaal that could well have been offensive to him. It was better, he thought, to see how a monument that enshrined an outdated or even offensive view of the past could be reinterpreted or renovated than it was to provoke a backlash from those still clinging to that old view of the past. So following his example, perhaps those memorial cairns to the explorations of Angus Macmillan could be reinterpreted by the addition of new plaques that tell the story of the dispossession and murder of the first peoples of Gippsland, or by the erection of new monuments that tell that story. Some Indigenous people will argue that the cairns and the message they convey are so offensive that demolition is the only alternative. But demolition, paradoxically, may erase memory of Macmillan's dark deeds, along with memory of the man himself. While monuments remain, they can be sites of protest and reflection, as well as veneration. Politicians and bureaucrats faced with a demand to demolish or remove a monument often refer it to a committee to weigh the pros and cons, like the Mayor of London, who recently commissioned an expert historical review of the city's huge catalogue of historic monuments. Perhaps they hope that with time, passions may cool and wiser heads will prevail. Sometimes the effect is simply to put the offensive statue or monument in cold storage until it can be brought out again. When I visited the Slovakian capital Bratislava a few years ago, I was amazed to see an imposing statue of Stalin, the Soviet dictator, outside the city's art gallery. Bratislava is only 200 kilometres from Budapest, where Hungarian patriots had toppled the dictator in 1956. And now here he was, resurrected from the vaults to advertise a retrospective exhibition of social realist art. For iconoclasts, toppling statues is a kind of political theatre. It's the drama of toppling that they seek, not the quiet removal of the statue by a bureaucrat. I'm reminded of a remark by the dramatist George Bernard Shaw: never beat a child except in anger. One might adapt it and say, never topple a statue except in anger. Only a very righteous indignation can justify what otherwise seems willful vandalism. the protesters have little time for subtleties of historical interpretation or complexities of character in the people whose statues they attack. James Cook, for example, was a brilliant navigator, a humane commander, and by the standards of the time, he had enlightened attitudes to the indigenous people he encountered. But none of this matters compared with his symbolic significance as the first British invader. During the weeks when demonstrators in Sydney and Melbourne were joining the worldwide Black Lives Matter movement, a multinational company, Zinc Rio Tinto, committed what was surely an act of monumental vandalism when it blew up the Juukan Caves, a place of cultural and political and spiritual significance for the Aboriginal people of the Pilbara for more than 40,000 years. When news of the impending catastrophe reached the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, he referred it to the Minister for the Environment, who had powers to stop it, and she did nothing, claiming that preparations for the explosions had advanced too far to stop. For more than 200 years, Australians of European descent have been attempting to cultivate a sense of their collective past by erecting statues of explorers, governors, politicians, soldiers, and sportsmen. On the whole, I'm not in favour of toppling them, not most of them at any rate. But I think I can appreciate why the first people of the land, feel that they want to topple them, while the rest of us have so little regard for their history and traditions.
Well, Graeme has alluded to twin impulses in tension within our societies. One's the impulse to veneration and worship on the one hand, and on the other to judgment and criticism. He identified two periods in Christian history where the impulse to judgment and criticism has led to destruction of icons and statues and religious images. These were in the iconoclastic controversy in the Eastern churches of the 7th and the 8th centuries, and in the 16th century struggles between the Protestant movements and the Catholic churches. The epidemic of statue toppling that Graeme's been describing has been largely Western in character, mainly involving the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia. When we look at the biblical roots of the impulse to topple statues, we're led immediately towards an intercultural framework. For the roots of the iconoclasm that we find in Scripture are found in the first two of the 10 Commandments. And these have had a deep influence not only on Christian, but also Jewish and Islamic cultures. Now, without wanting to broaden the conversation that Graeme's led us in too much, I think we should look briefly at how those texts have shaped Jewish and Islamic cultures and their attitudes to images and monuments, before we can then situate the Christian and secular Western tradition, and particularly the current pandemic of statue toppling, within that wider picture. The first and the second commandments express a fundamental orientation in early Israel towards images in general and idols in particular. And this orientation then flowed over into the history of Israel as the people of God. The first commandment at the beginning of Exodus chapter 20 is, "You shall have no other gods before me," or it can be translated, "beside me." And this commandment prohibits the worship of other gods, either over Yahweh, the God of Israel, or indeed alongside Yahweh. The second commandment that follows it is, "You shall not make for yourself an image, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." This commandment prohibits the making of images as such. Now, it gets a bit more complicated when this commandment continues, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them." And this little coda recapitulates the first commandment, even though it's attached to the second. And that raises, of course, a theological issue. Does the second commandment prohibit any form of image making in and of itself? Or is it only images that are worshipped, images or statues that embody false gods, or perhaps false principles? Now, there are a variety of parallel texts in the Old Testament. Exodus 34:17, Deuteronomy 27:15, Deuteronomy 4:9, and others. And these texts reveal a complex tradition history where these two interpretations, that is, a prohibition of image making in principle, as against a prohibition solely of images of other gods, jostle against each other for primacy. Now, at the risk of making a broad and sweeping generalisation, Jewish and Islamic cultures have tended to be suspicious of image making in and of itself, while the Christian tradition, by and large, has affirmed image making as a general principle, but within certain canons of evaluation, shaped by doctrine and taste. If we want to see proof of that, we only have to look at the whole history of Christian religious art and sculpture, which is grand and broad and deep. Now, the current epidemic of toppling statues falls within this broad Western tradition, where it is the values and meanings associated with a statue or a religious object that are the focus of both our gaze and our action. Now, if we look at Islam, it's a far more complex story. In 2001, the monumental Buddhist statues at Bamiyan were destroyed by the Taliban because of their association with a false religion, Buddhism, an argument that's very close to that of the Western statue topplers. However, just 4 years later, 12 cartoons of the Prophet were published in the Danish magazine Jyllands-Posten. And this led to protests in various parts of the world and an estimated death toll of about 250 people. 10 years after that, in January 2015, an attack at the Paris offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo left 12 dead. Now, in both of these cases of protest, it was the depiction of the Prophet at all, not just the way in which he was portrayed, that was protested. This aniconism, that is, this avoidance of representation of sentient beings, is a part of many Islamic traditions, and it constitutes part of that cultural divide between Islamic and Western Christian or secular cultures. So why has the Christian West taken a different path? Well, within the Old Testament, we have the first two of the Ten Commandments, but also examples where images, and particularly statues, are a focus of power and of contesting powers. In Exodus, we have the episode of the idolatry of the golden calf and the violent, purifying reaction of Moses in Exodus 32. In 1 Samuel 5, the Philistines capture the Ark of God, and they bring it as a spoil of war into the house of Dagon, and they placed it beside Dagon, that is, beside the statue or idol of their god, Dagon. Overnight, the statue toppled over, so they put it up again, and the following night it toppled again of its own accord, but this time lying broken when the people entered on the following morning. In various movements of spiritual renewal and reform in Israel, the toppling or destruction of sacred objects such as Asherah and terebinths were associated with movements of religious renewal and a return to the reading and the observing of the Jewish law. So within the Old Testament, in both commandment and in history, we find teaching that encourages the toppling of statues and religious monuments. However, in the New Testament, there isn't the same degree of struggle over religious objects. There is not a clearly iconoclastic spirit. We note that in cleansing the temple, Jesus clearly interrupted the operation of temple worship, and he prevented the sacred vessels from being carried through the temple. But this action was not connected with images or statues. In Mark 13, Jesus refers very clearly to social conflict being triggered by the erection of what he described as the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be. We can't be sure whether this was a statue or a Roman standard or symbol, but in either case, Jesus did not teach that this should trigger violence against the object, but rather be seen as a call to flee. Where in the New Testament we do see concern about toppling or destruction of monuments, it is not Christians who are proposing it, but other faiths that are fearing it. At his trial, Jesus faced charges that he would destroy the Jewish temple. In Acts chapter 19, an agitated and potentially violent crowd rioted against the Christians in defence of the sacred statue of the goddess Artemis in Ephesus. If you read the fine print of that chapter, even here the motivations involved were initially identified as economic, and only later were they identified as ideological. There is some evidence that rather than attacking the images and altars of other faiths and cultures, the earliest Christians sought to use them to spread their message. When questioned about paying taxes, Jesus called for a Roman coin to be brought to him, and he used the image of the emperor on the coin to confound his questioners. In Athens, Paul fixed upon a pagan altar to an unknown god, and rather than critiquing or attacking it, he used it to expound and explain his understanding of God. Now, one reason for the lack of contesting over idols and images in the New Testament could be the Pauline theology that no idol in the world really exists. See 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 4 following. Paul had a resulting theology or strategy of don't ask, don't tell, when he engaged with the very thorny and difficult issue of food offered to idols. You can see that explored in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Whatever its roots may have been, a more tolerant spirit seems to have animated the early Christian tradition. The trajectory of this tradition into the modern secular West would need really careful review, but it would appear that there is a broad tradition of not seeing statues and images as intrinsically evil, the way that some strands of Islam and Judaism might hold. Just how we who stand in that Western tradition debate the merits or otherwise of a statue is now the question. I loved what Graeme had to say, and I sense that he stands very much in the tradition of St. Paul, when he would try to draw an edifying moral or historical lesson from even the most offensive statue or pagan altar. And I think he would probably succeed. He's offered the suggestions of both Friedrich Nietzsche and Nelson Mandela for a more systematic approach as to how we make ethical judgments about such objects. But he's also recognised that the anger people feel and the genuine suffering that many have experienced feeds into that anger. And these both have to be taken very seriously as we make our moral judgments, not only about what should happen in the future, but what has happened past. Now, Graeme closes with an acknowledgement of the very recent destruction of the Dukin Caves in Australia and the important question of the continuing destruction of Indigenous monuments and culture by Australians of European descent. He recognises our blindness to the monumental and sacred values of Indigenous cultures and the damage that we have inflicted and continue to inflict. There's also a question of our blindness to the aniconic values of Islamic cultures and the offence that we have given there, sometimes quite intentionally, as we defend Western views of freedom of expression, with the resulting violence that has been aroused not just against statues or images, but against people. This phenomenon of a pandemic of toppling statues calls us to engage within our societies and our cultures in a dialogue around values and meanings, around how we're going to remember and teach our past. However, it also challenges us to look beyond ourselves and our own tradition, to recognise the value systems and monumentality of other cultures. And then we might begin to reflect upon our mutual obligations to acknowledge and respect the values and meanings of human beings of many political camps and cultural outlooks. We will come to a session soon where we invite you to join with Graeme and I in another Zoom conference where we can discuss these matters together. You can ask questions of either of us, and we can tease out some of the implications of this fascinating issue. Thank you, Graeme, for your sharing. Thank you all for watching and listening, and we look forward to participating with you in a Zoom conference, a webinar, to discuss these issues further.